Hey everybody, welcome back to our next episode, video, whatever we want to call it, in our ongoing exploration of many different things church. As you may have remembered from last week, we are starting off something or going with something here in the season of Lent that is connected with our midweek theme and biblical characters and stories that we are hearing. And this time around, this week, we are looking at the story of Naomi, who is broken by desperation, and her story is found. We're looking specifically in Ruth chapter 1, but it's really her story is part of the entirety of the Book of Ruth as a whole. So today I'm going to give you some background on the Book of Ruth and the character of Ruth and the character of Naomi and why their stories are kind of all intermingled and entwined in this and why ultimately their story is so important. Though, as we zero in on Naomi, hers is one of turmoil and pain and desperation, and more on that in a second. So that's kind of what we're going to look at this particular week. Now, the Book of Ruth is very short. Actually, side note before I even get into that, some of this may sound familiar. A year ago, we were going through slowly the book known as The Story, which is kind of the biblical narrative presented in more like chapter form, like more kind of almost novel form. And one of the chapters was the story of Ruth. So we kind of talked about this before. So again, this may sound familiar if you happen to catch that. That was sometime, I don't know, year and a half ago when we were looking at that. But okay, side note out of the way. The Book of Ruth, 4 chapters long. So it's very, very short. You can read it in probably about 5 minutes. It doesn't really take very long. The Bible, or the Christian Bible, places it between the book of Judges and the book of 1 Samuel in what we know as the Old Testament. Now, within the Torah, or the Jewish texts, places it in a different grouping with some different what we call books, but some different writings, what they call the festival scrolls. So Ruth is partnered with the books that we know as Esther, the Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and Lamentations. So, of course, the Hebrew scriptures themselves are a little bit different than or in terms of order and such, compared with what we have and what we call the Old Testament. But many of the things are the same. They have some other ones, I think, as well. But anyway, I'm going on tangents that I don't really need to. We place it fairly early on between the book of Judges and the book of 1 Samuel. Now, the setting, or maybe we want to talk about the time period, is important. It's when we hear about it in the very first verse, Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, that's during the time when the judges ruled. Now, the period when the judges were ruling was a time where Israel was very, very, very tribal in nature amongst the 12 tribes. They really were not cohesive as a single unit, and they certainly were not the country or the nation of Israel yet. That begins in 1 Samuel, but it's in that period that's between it. And it's roughly 1200 BC to maybe about 1000 BC. So about 1000 to 1200 years before Jesus is that time period, and we don't know exactly where in that time period Ruth falls. It's just at some point during that period. So, some different characters that we have featured that are important in the story, though some of them fade away almost instantly. We have an Israelite from Bethlehem named Elimelech, and he is from the tribe of Ephraim. He is the husband of Naomi, and they have 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, I think. Don't quote me on those pronunciations. They're hard. I don't read them very often. So we've got this family of 4. They live around Bethlehem, and there is a famine, so they relocate because there is no food. And the place where they end up is in the country of Moab. Now, Moab is a country or a region, whatever we want to call it. It's on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, a little bit farther south from where Bethlehem is in comparison. So Bethlehem is very even to the north end of the Dead Sea, and then Moab is kind of more on the southern end of the Dead Sea. So Moab is across the Dead Sea and a little farther south. It's in the midst of what we would now call kind of west central Jordan, but that's kind of where it's at. So they go there, and that's where they relocate for a time. Now, we hear in the narration that Elimelech dies seemingly very quickly. This means Naomi is now mourning, and she is now a widow. Fortunately, she has sons, because in that culture, if your husband died and you were a widow, it was expected that your children would care for you. So she has her sons. Over the course of the next 10 years, at some point, both sons marry Moabite women that go by the name of Orpah and Ruth, Ruth of the title of the book, Ruth. But then after 10 years, both sons died. So now we've got Naomi and her two daughters-in-law. It's unclear if Orpah and Ruth have both converted to be Jewish. It's likely that they did because their husbands were Jewish. So it's likely, or Israelite would actually be a better term here, but it's unclear if they have converted, but it is likely. Definitely with Ruth, though Orpah is more unclear. And the reason that that's unclear is that Ruth chooses to stay with Naomi as they return back to Israel. Orpah chooses to stay with her family. Now, this is at the direction of Naomi. Naomi tells both of them to do that. Orpah does. Naomi says, no, I will stay with you. So Naomi is definitely, it seems, converted over to be a foreign-born and yet converted Israelite. Orpah, we don't really know. So, okay. So later on in the story, after what we have read for our Wednesday night, but and included for that, but as part of the larger story, Naomi faces desperation due to the cultural status of women. She's faced a famine. She's a widow. She has no sons. And if she returns to Israel, well, no, let me back up. If she stays in Moab, she is the foreigner. And with that comes the difficulties that she will face on that front. If she returns to Israel, which is what she does, she has no status or ownership rights of her husband's property unless it is redeemed by a close relative. She also has a foreign daughter-in-law and the stigma that comes along with her being a Moabite. Now let's talk about that for a little bit. Why are Moabites bad at this point? And I'm going to use bad. Why are they considered bad? This goes back to Moses and the wilderness wanderings with the Israelites in the 40 years after the Exodus. In the book of Numbers, specifically chapter 22, but not limited to that, the Israelites are actually camping. They're seemingly living or staying for a time in Moab. And the locals, including King Balak of Moab, are afraid of them. And they try to hire a prophet, Balaam, to curse the Israelites. Side note, this side note story connects in with the story of Balaam's donkey, which if you know, you know, is hilarious. But it's not necessarily important here, but it is connected, just in case you're wondering. Additionally, to that whole, they tried to curse the Israelite situation. While they were camped there began to be some intermarriage at this time. And remember, this is the book of Numbers, so way before where we're at with the book of Ruth. But there was some intermarriage between the Israelites and the Moabites. And with that led some to begin worshiping the Moabite deities, which was not considered good. Therefore, the Moabites were considered at that time cursed and unacceptable by my understanding. Now, I don't want you to quote me on that because my understanding is not real complete on that front, but that's to the best of my current knowledge, that's what I know about them. So this is why Ruth's story is so important, because as the book goes on, Naomi's land, which was her husband's land, which technically now is one of her two sons' land, is redeemed by a relative named Boaz, who has met Ruth and actually shown compassion on her, and by proxy then shown compassion to Naomi. Now, since Ruth is the widow of the son who was the actual new landowner now, that's why Boaz marries her, if you know the story. So in addition to redeeming the land, or basically like claiming the land within this family, he also claims the widow, aka Ruth, so Boaz marries Ruth. Ruth and Boaz eventually have a child named Obed. Obed will become the father of Jesse, and if you know your genealogy, Jesse is the father of David, who will go on to be King David. So Ruth, this Moabite foreign woman, is the great-grandmother of King David, and therefore, since David is within the ancestral line of Jesus, dun 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 dun, Ruth is one of only 4 women who are named in the genealogy of Jesus. And here's what's really interesting. Of the 4 women, with the exception of Mary, the mother of Jesus, who is, of course, Jewish, the other 3 are all foreign. So we see some inclusion going on here in the very genealogy that goes down through the centuries, through King David, and eventually gets to Jesus. And I think that's really, really important for us to know. So Naomi, hers is a story of desperation, grief, hardship, but she is a vital part, a vital cog, if we want to use that word, although I don't like to because she's a person. She was a vital person in the inclusive nature that leads to both King David as well as Jesus' genealogy and how God goes about bringing about change. So in this instance, and this is what I'm going to end with, we have through Ruth a change in reckoning of who is considered acceptable, not acceptable, etc. And this is an ongoing theme of the Bible as God continues, I think, to move things forward as time and as society moves forward through the history and the narrative of the Bible. So in this instance, we go from the idea that all Moabites are bad because of that past history until Ruth finds favor with the Israelite Boaz and with God, which results in the line of King David. And that's just one aspect. There's a larger theme that fits into, but that's what's going on there. Sorry, I got a little bit longer with this than I had planned to, but hey, I get excited about this type of stuff. I hope you do too. Have a great discussion, and we'll catch you later.